Hey guys, welcome back to this channel, The Voice of the Past. In this video, we will unfold the untold story of the Monroe family's undying patriarch, a man who never ages. Before continuing, if you are new into this channel, please consider subscribing to this channel. Let's start. The Monroe estate had stood for over 2 centuries, a vast mansion looming over the secluded countryside, untouched by time. Its sprawling grounds stretched endlessly, lined with towering oak trees that seemed to whisper old secrets with every gust of wind. The halls inside were adorned with oil paintings, chandeliers, and grand staircases that had carried generations of the Monroe family. But within those walls, amidst the wealth and grandeur, there was a secret far more valuable, far more terrifying than any inheritance. Jonathan Monroe was a name that had never left the estate's records. To the outside world, the Monroes were a lineage of powerful figures, each head of the family assuming the name of Jonathan, a tradition passed down through the ages. But anyone who looked closer would find that something didn't add up. There were no burial records, no obituaries, no funerals, only a Jonathan Monroe, alive and well, always the same age. He was a ghost who walked in the flesh, a man whose very presence unsettled those who met him. No one ever dared question it. No one, except Evelyn Monroe. At 24, Evelyn was sharp, curious, and dangerously inquisitive. Unlike the others, she wasn't content with silence. She had grown up surrounded by whispers and careful glances exchanged between family members when Jonathan entered the room. She had seen how her father, her uncles, and even the Monroe matriarch spoke of him with unease, as if he were something more than just their relative. The more she watched him, the more she saw it. The way he never changed, the way he never tired, the way his presence felt almost too heavy, too consuming, as if he were something beyond human. It wasn't until she began digging through the family archives that the truth began to reveal itself. The Monroe Library was a treasure trove of history, its towering bookshelves holding records dating back centuries. The thick scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air as Evelyn sat alone one evening, combing through the fragile documents. It started as a simple curiosity. She wanted to trace her ancestry, to understand the deep roots of her family's legacy. But the deeper she dug, the stranger things became. There was something off about the Monroe records. She noticed an odd pattern. Every 40 years, a new Jonathan Monroe appeared, taking over as head of the estate. But when she compared their portraits, they were identical. Not just similar, identical. The same sharp eyes, the same strong jawline, the same confident posture. It was the same man. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to an old photograph dated 1883. It was a formal portrait, an oil painting showing Jonathan Monroe in an elegant black suit, standing beside the grand staircase of the very house she was in. The details were vivid, from the intricate embroidery on his coat to the faint glint of his signet ring. She had seen that ring before. She had seen it on his hand today. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the next page. Another portrait, 1843. The same face. Another, 1920. The same posture, the same sharp, knowing gaze that seemed to look through the canvas. She went further. 1945, 1975, 2005. Each image, whether a photograph or a painting, showed the same man untouched by time. Evelyn's stomach twisted. It wasn't just his appearance. It was the way he was always there, always at the center of power, watching over the family like an unchanging deity. Then she found the letter. It was buried beneath stacks of financial documents, nearly lost to time. The parchment was fragile, the ink faded, but the words were still legible. April 17th, 1924. My dearest Jonathan, the ritual is complete. The cycle remains unbroken. 40 more years before the next renewal. You must be careful now, the others suspect. Do not let them find the truth. The letter was unsigned, but it was sealed with an unfamiliar crest, one she had never seen before among the Monroe family emblems. Her heart pounded in her chest. Ritual, cycle, renewal. What did it mean? A cold draft slipped through the library, sending a shiver down her spine. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned her head toward the doorway. Jonathan stood there, tall, silent, watching. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His dark eyes locked onto hers, filled with something unreadable, something ancient. He didn't seem surprised to find her here, didn't seem angry. He had been expecting this. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. He took a slow step forward, and Evelyn felt the weight of his presence settle over her like a cold embrace. "Evelyn," he said softly. His voice was smooth, but there was something beneath it, something that didn't belong in the voice of an ordinary man. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, observing her. Then, just as slowly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the house. Evelyn exhaled sharply, feeling the tension snap like a wire pulled too tight. Her hand shook as she gripped the letter, her mind racing. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Whatever this ritual was, whatever this cycle was, it wasn't just about a family name. Jonathan Monroe wasn't aging because Jonathan Monroe was never meant to die. And she had a feeling she was about to learn exactly what that meant. Evelyn barely slept that night. Her mind raced, replaying every strange moment she had ever experienced with Jonathan Monroe. The way he never seemed to blink often enough. The way his voice had an unnatural steadiness, never faltering, never betraying emotion. The way family members spoke of him in hushed tones, always careful, always restrained. She thought of the letter. The ritual is complete. The cycle remains unbroken. 40 more years before the next renewal. It wasn't just a name being passed down. Jonathan Monroe never died because he never left. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3, the deep chime reverberating through the old house like a ghostly echo. She sat up in bed, staring into the darkness, her breath shallow. She had to know the truth. Pushing aside her hesitation, she grabbed a flashlight and quietly stepped out of her room. The hallway was eerily silent, the old wooden floorboards creaking under her weight as she made her way toward the east wing of the house, the part of the estate that no one ever spoke about. It was forbidden. No one went there, not the staff, not even the other Monroe family members. The doors remained locked at all times. But Evelyn had seen Jonathan enter those halls before, vanishing into the darkness like a shadow slipping through the cracks of reality. She reached the corridor, heart pounding. The heavy double doors that marked the entrance to the east wing loomed before her. Taking a slow breath, she reached out and turned the handle. It was unlocked. A chill ran down her spine. Stepping inside, she found herself in a dimly lit corridor lined with portraits of Jonathan Monroe. Each was from a different time period: 1870, 1871, 1872, 1873. The same face, the same man. At the end of the hall, there was a single door. It was different from the others, older, its wood darkened with age, its handle carved with strange symbols. The moment she touched it, a shiver ran up her arm, as if the door itself recognized her presence. Something lay beyond it, something not meant to be found. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned the handle and stepped inside. The room beyond was a study, untouched by time. A massive desk stood at its center, covered in scattered papers, old books, and what looked like ritualistic diagrams drawn in ink. Along the walls, bookshelves towered high, filled with tomes bound in cracked leather. But it was what sat in the middle of the room that made Evelyn freeze. A mirror. Tall, ornate, its edges decorated with carvings of symbols she didn't recognize. It was old, far older than anything else in the house. The glass was dark, almost like it had been stained by time itself. Something was wrong with its reflection. The room behind her was perfectly still, yet in the mirror the shadows moved. Evelyn took a step closer, her breath catching. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, as though something unseen was pressing against her chest. Then she saw it. A figure standing in the reflection. Her blood turned to ice. It was Jonathan. But it wasn't just him, it was all of him. Dozens of Jonathan Monroes standing behind the glass. Some were dressed in old-fashioned suits from the 1800s, others in military uniforms from the wars, some in modern clothing, all of them staring at her. She stumbled backward, slamming into the desk. The impact knocked over a stack of papers, revealing something beneath, a small leather-bound journal. Her shaking hands reached for it, flipping it open. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. The body weakens, the soul does not. The cycle must continue. 40 years. 40 years until the next renewal. The vessel is only temporary. The words blurred as her vision swam with realization. The vessel. Jonathan Monroe wasn't immortal. He was simply transferring himself, over and over again. Her stomach twisted. But if the transfer fails, the soul is trapped, locked away, a prison of mirrors. Evelyn's gaze snapped back to the mirror. The figures were closer now, their eyes locked onto hers with an unnatural hunger, a desperate pleading, as if they were screaming from within a prison she couldn't hear. Then behind her, the door creaked. She turned slowly, her breath hitching. Jonathan stood in the doorway. For the first time in her life, his ever-calm expression faltered. His dark eyes flicked from her to the mirror, then to the journal in her hands. He sighed. "You shouldn't have come here, Evelyn." His voice was soft, almost regretful. But beneath it, she could hear something else, something ancient. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. Jonathan stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the floor, cast by the dim candlelight. His face, always composed, always unreadable, was now painted with something different: recognition, understanding, and, for the first time, a flicker of something dangerously close to fear. Evelyn swallowed hard, clutching the leather-bound journal to her chest. She could still feel the presence of the figures in the mirror behind her, the weight of their unseen gazes pressing against her back. She knew, deep in her bones, that she had seen something she was never meant to see. "You knew I would come here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan stepped forward. His movements were slow, deliberate. "Curiosity is in your nature," he said. It was only a matter of time. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the book. "And what happens now?" Jonathan tilted his head, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "Now, we talk." There was something unsettling about his words. Not a threat, not a warning, but something worse, an inevitability. Evelyn refused to be intimidated. "You're not human, are you?" Jonathan exhaled through his nose, almost amused. "That depends on how you define human." She stepped sideways, keeping her distance. "You transfer yourself, every 40 years, into a new body." Jonathan remained still, his gaze unwavering. "The ritual," Evelyn continued, her voice steadier now. "This isn't just about passing down a name. It's about survival. You, your soul, your essence, whatever you want to call it. You've been hopping from one body to the next for over a century, haven't you? Jonathan regarded her with something almost like admiration. You put the pieces together faster than most. Most. The word sent a chill through her. She knew what it meant. She wasn't the first Monroe to uncover the truth. And if she wasn't the first, then what had happened to the others? Jonathan took another step toward her. Evelyn, you need to understand. This family, this legacy, it exists because of the cycle. The Monroe name has endured because I have endured. The power, the wealth, the influence. It has all been built on my continuity. She shook her head. That's not continuity. That's control. Jonathan didn't deny it. Evelyn's breathing grew shallower. How does it work? She asked, hating the way her voice trembled. How do you transfer? For the first time, Jonathan hesitated. His silence was answer enough. Evelyn's eyes flickered back to the mirror. The dozens of Jonathan Monroes trapped within the glass, their faces twisted in silent agony. The others, she whispered. The ones before you. The ones that failed. Jonathan followed her gaze but said nothing. Evelyn's stomach twisted. This isn't perfect, is it? She said, the words rushing out now. Some transfers don't work. And when they fail, she turned back to him. They end up trapped, in there. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Sacrifices must be made. A sick feeling washed over her. And when you take a new body, she stopped. Her hands began to shake. It's not just anyone, is it? Jonathan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. It must be someone of Monroe blood. Evelyn's body went cold. The realization hit her like a crashing wave, pulling her under, suffocating her with its truth. Every 40 years, Jonathan Monroe didn't just find a new body. He took it. From someone in the family. Her hands trembled as she took a step back, horror creeping into every part of her being. No, she whispered. No, that's necessary, Jonathan interrupted. His voice was calm, unwavering, as if he were discussing the weather. The cycle cannot be broken, Evelyn. You see that now? She shook her head violently. You kill your own bloodline, your own family. Jonathan's gaze darkened. I preserve them. Evelyn let out a hollow, breathless laugh. Is that what you told the others? The ones before me? Jonathan sighed as if he were speaking to a child who refused to understand. Evelyn, this is bigger than you. Bigger than me. This cycle, it was set in motion long before you or I were born. I merely uphold it. Uphold it by stealing lives? She spat. What happens when your 40 years are up this time? What happens when your body starts to fail? Jonathan's expression didn't change. He didn't need to say it. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. It's me, she whispered. Jonathan didn't deny it. She felt the walls closing in, the air growing thinner. All her life, she had been watched, guided, subtly led down a path she hadn't even known existed. And now she saw it for what it truly was. Jonathan had been preparing her for this, for his next body. She took another step back, gripping the journal like it was a lifeline. You can't run, Evelyn, Jonathan said, his voice smooth, patient. It doesn't work that way. The cycle must continue. You're a Monroe. This is your purpose. She turned on her heel and bolted. Jonathan's voice followed her, steady, unhurried. You can run if you'd like, but you'll never escape it. Evelyn sprinted down the corridor, her heart hammering. The portraits of Jonathan Monroe blurred past her, their eyes seeming to follow her with each desperate step. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get out. The truth had finally revealed itself, and if she didn't stop it, she would be next. Evelyn ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from him. The Monroe estate was a labyrinth of corridors, towering staircases, and endless rooms filled with secrets that had been buried for centuries. The walls felt like they were closing in, the house itself a prison designed to keep her inside. Jonathan's voice echoed in the halls behind her, eerily calm, as if he had all the time in the world. "You're making this difficult, Evelyn." She didn't stop. Her feet pounded against the marble floors, her breath coming in short gasps. The journal was still clutched in her hands, the weight of its truth burning against her skin. She skidded into the west wing, the oldest part of the house. Dust coated the furniture, the air thick with age and forgotten memories. This place had been abandoned for decades, left to rot while the rest of the estate flourished. She threw herself into a room, slamming the door behind her. Darkness. The only light came from the moon, spilling through the tall, broken window. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by her frantic movements. Her pulse pounded as she backed away, pressing herself against the far wall. She needed time, needed to think. Then she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. She held her breath. Jonathan's voice was just outside the door now, quiet but unmistakable. "I know you're in there, Evelyn." She didn't move. The doorknob turned. Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to stay still. If she moved, if she made a sound, he would know exactly where she was. The door creaked open an inch, then another. A shadow stretched across the floor. She could see the edge of his polished shoes. Jonathan didn't enter. He simply stood there, his presence suffocating. "You remind me of the others," he said softly. "The ones who fought, the ones who thought they could break the cycle." Evelyn's breath hitched. "But none of them did," he continued, "because the cycle is not meant to be broken." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, he stepped away. His footsteps faded down the corridor, and after a moment, he was gone. Evelyn stayed frozen, waiting, listening. Nothing. She exhaled shakily, her hands trembling as she finally allowed herself to move. She needed an escape. She turned, scanning the room for another way out, and that's when she saw it. An old wooden chest, half buried under a sheet. Something about it felt important. She hesitated for only a second before kneeling and prying the heavy lid open. Inside, among the faded linens and forgotten trinkets, she found a bundle of letters. Not just any letters. Letters addressed to former Monroe heirs. Her fingers worked quickly, tearing through them. The ink was faded, but the words were clear enough. "Jonathan cannot be trusted. He will come for you, just as he came for me. There is a way to stop him, but it requires something he fears." Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs. A way to stop him. Her eyes flicked to the bottom of the chest, where something cold and metallic glinted under the moonlight. A dagger. The handle was carved with the same symbols as the mirror in the forbidden room. Her mind raced. The mirror. The trapped souls. The cycle. Jonathan Monroe wasn't untouchable. He had a weakness. And now, she had a weapon. She wasn't going to run anymore. She was going to end this. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the dagger's handle. It was heavier than she expected, its blade unnaturally cold against her skin. The ancient carvings along its hilt pulsed faintly under the moonlight, as though alive with some long-forgotten power. This dagger, this was the key. Somehow, someone before her had discovered a way to fight back, to stop Jonathan. But they had failed. She wouldn't. Taking a deep breath, she shoved the letters into her coat pocket, concealing the dagger beneath the folds of fabric. She needed to act fast. Jonathan had already shown his patience, but she knew it wouldn't last forever. The air in the room was thick, charged with something unseen. She had spent her life under this roof, but now every shadow felt darker, every hallway more constrictive. This house was his domain, a cage built to keep her in place until the next cycle began. Number, not this time. She slipped out of the room and back into the corridors, her footsteps light against the polished floors. Somewhere deep in the estate, the old grandfather clock struck 4, the chime reverberating through the walls like a hollow warning. Time was running out. She made her way back toward the mirror room, the place where she had first seen the trapped souls. It made sense now. They weren't just echoes of Jonathan's past lives. They were his failures. The souls that didn't transfer properly, the ones that got left behind. And if they were trapped, then that meant there was a way to sever the ritual. She reached the hallway leading to the forbidden wing, every nerve in her body screaming at her to turn back. But she forced herself forward, her grip tightening on the dagger beneath her coat. Then, a sound. A whisper just behind her ear. "Evelyn." She spun, the dagger half drawn. But no one was there. The shadows along the hallway shifted, something moving just beyond her vision. Her pulse raced. She wasn't alone. For a second she thought Jonathan had found her, but as she listened, she realized the sound wasn't coming from the hall. It was coming from the mirror room. Heart pounding, she pushed forward, inching toward the door. The air grew heavy, pressing against her chest. The closer she got, the more she could hear the whispers. Dozens of voices layered atop one another, pleading, crying, desperate. She stepped inside. The mirror stood before her, its dark glass shifting like a pool of black water. And in it, the trapped souls of the past Jonathans, their faces twisted with silent agony. But this time, they weren't just staring at her. They were reaching for her. Evelyn stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The figures within the glass clawed at the surface, their mouths opening in silent screams. They weren't just ghosts. They were trying to warn her. A cold chill ran down her spine. Then, behind her, footsteps. Slow, measured. She knew who it was before she even turned. Jonathan, standing in the doorway, watching her. "You found the letters," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "And the dagger." Evelyn didn't move. Jonathan sighed, stepping forward. "You were never supposed to see this room, Evelyn. You were never supposed to steal lives," she shot back. Jonathan tilted his head, regarding her with something close to amusement. "Steal? No, Evelyn. I have preserved this family. Without me, there would be no Monroes, no estate, no legacy, only nothingness." Evelyn's fingers twitched around the dagger. "And how many people had to die for that legacy?" Jonathan sighed. "It is the price of permanence." Her body tensed. Not anymore. She lunged. The dagger flashed under the dim light, aiming for his chest. But Jonathan was faster. He sidestepped smoothly, grabbing her wrist in an iron grip. The force of it sent her off balance, and she crashed against the mirror, her breath knocked from her lungs. Jonathan wrenched the dagger from her grasp with ease, holding it between them. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "You don't understand, Evelyn," he murmured, his voice almost pitying. "You never did." Then he raised the dagger. Evelyn barely had time to react. Jonathan thrust it forward, and the moment the blade touched her skin, the mirror exploded. A deafening shatter filled the room as the glass erupted outward in a storm of splinters and darkness. The trapped souls within the reflection let out a silent scream, their faces twisting as they were pulled from their prison. Jonathan staggered back, his grip on the dagger loosening. Evelyn hit the floor, gasping. The air in the room shifted, the once heavy presence turning into a howling void. Something ancient and enraged had been unleashed. The souls didn't just escape. They were coming for him. Jonathan's body jerked, his features contorting in pain. His shadow twisted unnaturally, his eyes widening as the darkness pulled at him. "No," he breathed. This is not... The hands of his past selves reached from the shattered mirror, dragging him backward. Jonathan screamed. For the first time, Evelyn saw fear in his eyes. He clawed at the ground, but the force was relentless. The souls of his past, the ones he had abandoned, the ones lost in failed transfers, were taking him back. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, stumbling away just as Jonathan was ripped into the mirror's remains, his body vanishing into the abyss. And then, silence. The air stilled. The pressure lifted. The mirror, what was left of it, was empty. Jonathan Monroe was gone. Evelyn stood there, heart hammering, staring at the place where he had disappeared. It was over. The cycle had finally been broken. Or so she thought. Because as she turned to leave, something in the shattered glass shifted. A reflection lingered, not hers. Jonathan Monroe's face stared back at her. And then, he smiled. Evelyn stood frozen. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her fingers trembling at her sides. The room was silent, save for the occasional drip of blood from a cut on her arm where the mirror shards had grazed her. But none of that mattered, because in the jagged remnants of the shattered mirror, Jonathan Monroe was still there. He shouldn't be. She had watched him get dragged into the abyss, torn apart by the souls of his past. She had heard his scream, felt the pressure lift from the air the moment he vanished, and yet, his reflection remained. He stood just beyond the cracked glass, his expression eerily calm. No struggle, no fury, just a knowing smile. Evelyn's stomach twisted. "No," she whispered. "This isn't possible." Jonathan's eyes flicked up to meet hers. "You still don't understand, do you?" A cold dread seeped into her bones. She took a step back. Jonathan took a step forward, but not in the mirror, in the real world. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She turned around slowly, and there he was, standing behind her, real, flesh and blood. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her mind screaming that this wasn't right. He was gone. He was supposed to be gone. "You broke the mirror," Jonathan said, his voice disturbingly smooth. "But you didn't break the cycle." Evelyn shook her head, her eyes darting between him and the shattered glass. I stopped it. You were dragged into..." "The past," Jonathan interrupted. "Yes, my previous vessels were pulled back. The echoes of my failures finally claimed what was left of them." His lips curled into something close to amusement. "But not me, Evelyn. I am the cycle." Her blood turned to ice. The dagger. She needed the dagger. She lunged for it, but Jonathan was faster. His hand caught her wrist, squeezing just tight enough to stop her without breaking her bones. "You were always meant to be part of this, Evelyn," he murmured. "You were chosen before you were even born." She fought against his grip, but he pulled her closer, lowering his voice. "You did exactly what I needed you to do." Evelyn's entire body went still. "What?" Jonathan chuckled, low and dark. "You think you stopped me, but all you did was reset the cycle. The ritual isn't about preservation, Evelyn. It's about transformation." His grip tightened, his voice like a whisper woven into her bones. "I needed you to break the mirror, to free the past." Evelyn's throat went dry. Jonathan leaned in just slightly, his breath brushing her ear. "Because now, I no longer need a new body." She barely had time to react before a searing pain erupted through her skull. A force ripped through her mind, like invisible hands clawing into her very essence. She screamed, her body convulsing as something pushed inside her. Her vision blurred, darkness flooding her senses. She tried to fight, to hold on to herself, but the weight was unbearable. A shadow seeped into her mind, twisting, reshaping, familiar yet foreign, like something had always been waiting inside her, just waiting to wake up. Her knees buckled. The world around her dimmed. And then, silence, stillness. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse steadied. Evelyn stood up. But something was different. The cold burn of fear was gone. The panic, the desperation, all of it dissipated like a dream fading with the morning light. She felt calm. Her gaze shifted to the shattered mirror, her reflection staring back. Not wide-eyed, not afraid, composed, steady. Her lips curled into a knowing smile. And then, Jonathan Monroe's voice filled her head. "I told you, Evelyn, the cycle cannot be broken." Realization struck, slow and terrible. She lifted her hand, but it was no longer just hers. Jonathan Monroe wasn't outside her anymore. He was inside her. She turned toward the door, her movements fluid, precise. Every step felt familiar, practiced, like muscle memory she had never known before. She understood now. She had never been meant to be sacrificed. She had been meant to replace him. Jonathan Monroe had not stolen her body. He had become her. A slow exhale escaped her lips. The Monroe family would continue. The legacy would remain unbroken. And the world would never know. Because Evelyn Monroe, Jonathan Monroe, had just been reborn. And his story was far from over. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, hit that like button and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know on which topic you would like to see stories next. And check out these other stories you might enjoy. See you in the next one. Till then, take care and goodbye.